Sound good.
Nobody can be like Jesus Christ. Like, this is just all bull crap. I'm like, but there's evil around us, and these evil people are just being super successful at being evil. But then I was listening to what you were saying about Bitcoin and how all of the seven sins connect, and I'm just like, would it be bad to say just I don't want to try to say Bitcoin is Jesus, but it's like freaking sending a God-given solution that its greatest strength is also its greatest weakness. But if the greatest strength stays, we'll get a chance to fix this planet.
So it's funny that you mentioned that. Since writing that, because I'm not a religious scholar, I've been very hesitant to draw any parallels between Jesus, the role that he played in that period of time to then found a lot of these principles, to what we're seeing now. And are there parallels between what Jesus did? And I'm not calling Satoshi Nakamoto a messiah, but are there parallels between what Jesus did and what Satoshi has done? And there, I think, are quite a few there. Not to say that he's a messiah, but maybe we've finally found someone that's able to act in that image to a degree where we've now created something of such great value.
STAKK is to bring to you all the way from the top of Mount Itoto, Ethiopia. It's your boy Brazen. Today on the show we have with us Arvind. Is it future Dr. Arvind Nathan? Can we use that line?
No,
Because
can't use future doctor.
It just sounds right.
No future doctor.
Yeah. Okay, no problem. We're in there. All right, no problem. So we have Arvind on the show with us today. Arvind is the founder of the Bitcoin Curve, a research publication exploring how to scale Bitcoin beyond principles of money. A non-executive director at Melbourne Support Services, group strategy and performance lead at Telstra. Did I pronounce that correctly? Telstra?
Correct.
All right. He draws from his incredible experiences alongside his work as a PhD candidate to tackle his research efforts. We're going to be leaving a link for some of Arvind's work down below and his research publication down below as well. So before we jump right into it, I have to say, Arvind, some of the stuff that we've seen you publish on Twitter, absolutely impressive. Very interesting and entertaining stuff as people were exploring Bitcoin every day. I think we have to give props just to anyone who is just taking that time out of their day, right? Putting in the efforts and the dedication to try to educate the masses about Bitcoin on the level that you are. You know, this is a space where there is no formal education. It's almost like you have to either figure it out yourself. So maybe we'll take it from a very simple point there. How did you first hear about Bitcoin? How did you get into it? When did you buy your first Bitcoin? Tell us.
All right. So I probably first entered the space more broadly, and I'll start with my shitcoin journey. So I entered the space probably in 2016, 2017. So my background's in IT sales and consulting. And in Australia, that started off with a lot of work in cloud computing in the early 2010s. And then there's this concept that started emerging called smart cities, which is where you would integrate technology, sensors, the internet with city infrastructure like roads, public lights, bins and whatnot. So my career took a bit of a pivot in 2015, 2016 to start exploring smart cities in Australia and specifically how you would make that work. And my role there was as an advisory consultant to say, how would you make it work? What would be the return on investment and why you should make the investment? And I was doing that work for the Adelaide government, which is in South Australia. That journey made me realize that digital identity was going to be one of the key elements to make this work. Because if everything is digital, how does a citizen interact with that infrastructure to get the benefit from it? They have to have some form of digital identification so that this digital city infrastructure could recognize who it is and start giving some of that value. And that scared the crap out of me because then I realized, okay, now the surveillance state would start to flourish, and suddenly the Australian government would have this view on everybody's lives. You would have no privacy, and that scared the crap out of me. And at the time, the only solution that I saw that could potentially bridge this gap was Ethereum. Because at the time, this was still proof of work, I believe. They hadn't quite migrated over to proof of stake. It was
Yeah.
to the point of the blockchain. It was a decentralized digital platform, and it allowed for smart contracts, which meant that we could do identity. So I started going down the path of, could Ethereum be the layer of digital identity to power a smart city without breaching our rights of privacy? Anyway, I went down that rabbit hole, realized that that would be even worse because you'd have Ethereum Foundation being the owner of this digital identity effectively. They would have
Right.
the ability to change their protocol. And instead of it being just Australia as the challenge, now suddenly your digital identity globally was now at risk. So at that
Whoa.
point,
Okay.
I started pivoting away from smart cities. I thought, you know what, this isn't the area that I want to spend my time and effort. I didn't want to be an enabler for that as a future state. So I sort of went dormant at that point. So 2017 was when I bought my first bit of Bitcoin and my first bit of Ethereum, but I was mainly Ethereum. I think it was 90% Ethereum, 10% Bitcoin at that point. And it was me testing the waters. Fast forward three, 3 or 4 years, we're at 2020, and suddenly the COVID pandemic hit. And I live in Melbourne, Australia. We were the most locked down city in the world. So my Bitcoin journey really started through the government locking me down in my home, not being able to travel more than 5 kilometers from my home for 262 days out of the 2 years, I
Yeah.
think it was. Like that
Yeah.
was the big eye opener that actually we don't really have sovereign freedoms. I wouldn't say sovereign freedoms. We don't have the freedom to do what we need to do in the country that we live in. This is Australia,
Yeah.
which is a first world Western democratic society, and yet we're subject to this. So that's when I went down the rabbit hole of
I
the whole
think it
Bitcoin
looks.
piece, self-sovereignty.
I think the Western world has always looked free until we got to this certain period of time when it became very clear that it's not as free as it looks. It's just an illusion. I want to ask this, just a bit of a just deviating a bit here, but when it comes to the lockdowns, it seems like it's one of those things where it's almost like the people with the power sticking it to the people. But do you see that as maybe actually what ended us that maybe ended up being a horrible move on their part? Kenny, you're on mute, by the way. No, I was. Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Yes,
can hear
yes.
you
I
now.
was I was saying the
Okay.
hyenas were still in your connection.
Yes.
Maybe try turning off the
Hear me now.
camera, and that might allow you
I'll just try
to.
that block move by the elites were. Oh yes, let's just try that.
Yeah. See,
Right.
this is
Any
what
better?
happens. This is what happens when you have Australia, America, and Africa. But for
Oh
some
no.
odd reason, Africa doesn't
I
work.
don't
What's going on,
you
man?
know, yeah, I guess I was just saying, do you think that period of time really ended up being a mistake for the elites? Because the amount of learning that happened for, say for myself or for Kenny was quite incredible during that period of time.
Maybe. And I don't think we can talk in certainties on it because I
Yeah.
could play devil's advocate to that and say there's very few of us, when you think about the global population, that actually woke
Well,
up to start asking the questions and start doing the research and going down these rabbit holes. The vast majority of the population actually was complicit and thought it was the right thing. And the piece that was really interesting to me was the government that was in place in Victoria, where we had the longest lockdowns. They went to election after instituting all those lockdowns, 262 days. our premier, so the head of the state here, who was largely responsible for it, had gone in front of a commission to answer for why we were so locked down for all the challenges. And his response to pretty much almost every major question was, I don't recall. So in front of the public, saying he doesn't recall how decisions were made, who was responsible, and yet the state of Victoria re-elected him for doing a good job. So to your point, did it really open up the eyes? I'd say for the majority of the population, no. I'd still say that they thought that that was in their best interests, that locking down the state, restricting freedoms for the purposes of public health and public safety. Absolutely, the majority of people here thought that that was the right thing to do. So that's point one. But to your point, to the people that were having their eyes opened, I think it started probably an accelerated movement. And one of the articles that I published was about technology adoption. I think what this has done, it's going to get us across what we call the technology adoption chasm, which is at about 16 to 17% of population adoption is where other technologies start to stall and often fail and don't become mainstream. I think that may have been the impetus to get us over that hump. And we've already started to see that, not in Australia, but 5 other countries around the world where they've gone over this hump. They're at now 20+% population adoption for Bitcoin and crypto assets more broadly. This may be that accelerator. And we're starting to see in Australia a couple of libertarian movements start to gain a bit more traction. A few more Bitcoin clubs are starting to pop up. The education is starting to accelerate forward. And stuff like what I do, what you guys do as well, is just lifting it into the more mainstream, into ways that people can understand because we come from different perspectives. The more voices you have articulating it slightly differently, the more likely you are to land that message with a particular individual that then becomes an advocate. And so you start this snowball effect. And I think it might have just kicked off that snowball. We're rolling down that hill, picking up steam, picking up mass, and eventually, oh, look, I'm 100% bullish. I think we'll get onto a Bitcoin standard eventually, but it's just a matter of time. So maybe in the long term, yes, but short term, I don't think it did much.
I was listening to you talk and I was just thinking in my head, like, you're transitioning from crypto was exactly the same thing I went through because I was an IT computer science major undergrad, management information system technology, even though I did computer science for the first 2 semesters at grad school. I eventually changed to the School of Business because I figured that was where the money was. I wasn't geeky enough. And when I jumped in, I was thinking the same way. I was thinking this is a new technology, a lot more efficient, a lot more decentralized. It's taking control away from the centralized companies like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and decentralizing it. So I was a big fan. At this point, I've not read the Bitcoin Standard. I was not really big into Bitcoin. Cardano sold itself really well to me. It made sense. But going back to what you're saying, what happened in the crypto space is going to be worse when governments have that level of control, because now you're taking the control from private organizations into a lot more privatized but cloud. So now nobody's responsible in the cloud infrastructure, which is what most of these blockchains are. They're all on some server, right? But the biggest issue that people are not seeing with altcoins is that we are now decentralizing the responsibility, but with more centralization. I'm not sure if I'm making sense here. It's like, oh, I am no longer responsible because you can't say who's responsible, but the person that is responsible, you can't touch them. You can't see them.
Yep. 100%.
That is
100%.
worse. That is worse than what we're dealing with right now. And then, I don't know how you guys do it in Australia, man. I'm not sure how you guys have not lost your brains. You guys have the most centralized, most controlling, like I watch what your farmers are going through. I watch what your business owners are going through in terms of taxation. I walk like live in the country and the limitations that you guys go through. I'm like, are you guys like the paper pusher for the WEF and the IMF and the World Bank, because your placement in the world right now is to just distract China and Russia and just make sure that you're there to just be a pain in the butt. But the citizens, are not benefiting from it.
No. And I think we're actually a test case. And I came up with this theory that we're the test case. So ourselves, Canada and New Zealand,
Hmm.
I think we're all going through very similar things at the moment. Canada's introducing or tried to introduce 62% taxation rates. Australia is sitting at, I think, 45% taxation rates, but really, really high capital gains taxes, property
Hmm.
taxes.
Hmm.
Like we're a very highly taxed nation, and
Yep.
New Zealand's in a very similar boat. And the reason why I think that we're a test case, my father, and I'll rewind now, my father was a Oracle IT implementation specialist.
Hmm.
And back in the late 80s, early 90s, a lot of the newest technologies out of the US and Oracle used to be deployed in Australia first because
Hmm.
we were far enough away from the rest of the world where no one would hear about it. But we were the similar type of population that you would expect out of Europe and the US so that you could get meaningful data on how well a product or service would be in that market. So a lot of innovations from Oracle used to start in Australia, and that's what my father told me. I think it's a very similar piece again, but in this case, it's about a level of control and influence where they're able to test how can we administer, I'd call it, these controls in a Western democratic society that, but far enough away and small enough that it won't necessarily reverberate throughout the entire world if it were to fail. And if you think, and this is more the conspiracy element of me thinking out loud here, is if you were the WEF or you were some sort of centralized global authority or a conglomerate of individuals that are aligned on these more
Yep.
totalitarian principles, it would make a lot of sense to try it in Canada, so you're close to North America, Australia, you're in Oceania and APAC, because they're small population sizes, large land masses, and away from everything else. So I think this could be a test case. And if we don't really push back in these two countries, then the likelihood of Europe pushing back, and this is most of Eastern Europe, the states I think have gone through their own sort of thing from afar. I've never lived there. I just see what I see on Twitter. I actually don't trust what I see on mainstream
News.
sources because it is incredibly biased. But Twitter
Yep.
seems to be able to provide that balance. The culture of the US is one of pushing back against the powers, because that's where effectively the founding of the United
Yep.
States started from, and that culture is permeated. So I think that there's a lot of hope over there. Australia, we are a very ubiquitous country, and both sides of politics, if I look at where Australia is, are very similar. We have our own conservative government called the coalition or the Liberal government, and we've got our more what you would call democratic um, government, which we call Labor. But the differences between these two parties is nowhere near as extreme as what I see in the US between the Democrats and the Republicans. Ours are much closer together on a set number of core principles, and so where it's more of the same regardless of who you choose. One just happens to go nuclear at the moment. One's going renewable, but they both agree with online e-safety. So it's not like there's this huge polarizing where you've got a good choice in a second party that you think could get change. So again, talking to that point of why Australia might be a good test bed for a lot of this, that might be it.
No kidding though, because remember back when UAVs were a big thing, Amazon was testing the UAV delivery Australia.
Yep.
Uh,
Yeah.
Amazon did a lot of their test beds in Australia, if I remember correctly. Flying cars, all that stuff was being tested in Australia. I think America also has a couple of test areas with satellites in Australia as well, a huge base in Australia for testing out these new weapons because apparently it's such a huge desert, nobody gets impacted. So I don't
Because
think it's
we're
going
only
go
we're only
ahead.
26 million people. 26 million people on a landmass that's I don't think it's as big as the US, but it's pretty close.
Yes, huge, huge.
So, and the
Pretty
central
much, yeah.
part, to be honest, is all desert. So we're really, if you look at Australia, you just look at the coastline. That's where the population is. We're not really central at all. And the other point for the US is because when you think about this call, we've got Africa, we've got Australia, we've got the US, we're in 3 different locations. I think location-wise, when you think about satellite communications, when you think about making sure you have a 360 view of the world, you'd want some sort of base of operations here as well.
Yep.
So we're this very unique
Absolutely.
country for the US, the West in general, because we're far enough away that we give a level of diversification geographically for assets. And then at the same point, we're largely an empty landmass with a very tiny population. So we're always going to be in need of help from allies to make sure our borders stay protected, secured, which is why we're very reliant on the US, from what I can see, for a lot of that, which means that they can then influence far greater.
Yeah, I think this this test case situation is very real. Recently, I was in Singapore, and I could almost say it seems like Dubai was a test for what was Singapore was about to become, which is essentially a place where you have rules for banks, a place where they can, I guess, a fertile zone for people in that space, but not so much for the locals. And when you speak of you know, the 2 political parties in Australia there being very similar, I think at this point in time in the US, if most people look at it, they could probably say it does not matter which party you vote for. It's all going down to hell in a handbasket, right? But this this is where I think one of the topics which you mentioned here is really comes into play, which is Bitcoin solving for human behavior.
Mhm.
Can you talk to us a little bit more about that? Because I know for the maxis and for most people who start getting into Bitcoin, it's well, maybe it's an investment. You're hoping to make a lot of money. For Bitcoin maxis, it is whatever sort of insane, I guess, group activity that they want to make it be, right? Just Bitcoin only and buy Bitcoin, but they're not talking about some of the very important things here, like this solving for human behavior. Share a little
Yeah,
bit more with us on that one.
absolutely. So my Bitcoin journey went to a point where I probably am where most, I wouldn't call the Bitcoin maximalists. I think that they're in their own class of individual that really push on the fundamentals, on the technical economic fundamentals of Bitcoin far more than I ever will. So I wouldn't necessarily
Right.
put myself into that basket. But when I went down my journey, I kept on asking myself, well, why is Bitcoin successful? Because in my corporate
Yeah.
career, we always have to get to the root cause of everything so that any investment that we do is tackling the root cause, the root outcome, rather than a band-aid solution over a symptom. And in the back of my head, when I was going down this Bitcoin journey, I got that sixth sense that I developed in my career to say, we haven't quite landed what that fundamental element is that's making this successful. And when I kept
Right.
asking why, and I published the thought process across 2 articles on my Substack, I got to the conclusion that Bitcoin wasn't solving for money, but Bitcoin was solving for human behavior. And the
Mhm.
framework that I found that fit this best was, I actually came from a religious bit of religious background, which was the 7
Right.
deadly sins. And when you look at the challenges that are experienced in the current financial system, they all surround one of those 7 deadly sins. And what Bitcoin has done is effectively eliminated or at least mitigated as much as humanly possible those sins manifesting themselves through human behavior. Now, that one there, you can go through a couple of examples as to how that all makes sense. But the 7 deadly sins here being pride, being the source of the other 6 deadly sins, which is based on ego and self-interest. But then you've got greed, gluttony, you've got wrath, sloth, envy, and I've forgotten one. Which one have I forgotten? I better pull up the
Mm,
article so I can have a look at it. But anyway, so when you start to look at Bitcoin's principles, Bitcoin through the lens of these seven deadly sins, you start to see that some of the technical features that we see in Bitcoin are actually addressing that fundamentally. So my definition of Bitcoin when I went through this journey as well was Bitcoin is a scarce, secure, and decentralized digital asset. And I started with the definition because from my view is if I couldn't explain it simply or define it simply, I didn't understand it well enough. Because it's very easy to make something complex, but it's very complex to make something simple. So I came down to that 7-word definition. So regardless of who I talk to, it's scarce, secure, decentralized digital asset. Now, sitting underneath that, scarcity, as an example. Scarcity comes from the fact that Bitcoin only has 21 million. Now, we will often in the Bitcoin space hear that, fiat money is a Ponzi, fiat money, it's a soft currency, it's something that can be easily produced. And as a result of it being easily produced, it can be debased very easily. And that's what we're seeing with money printing. And so 21 million and that hard cap creates a level of scarcity that preserves the value. But the question that I then asked myself in that scenario was, well, why do we actually need scarcity to begin with? Because if you put it from the lens of we assume that every single person on this planet was a very moral, upstanding citizen that did everything that was in the best interest of the collective, then it didn't matter whether or not it was scarce or not. We could trust that everyone would do the right thing and not print when they knew it was at odds or in opposition to everyone else, because there would be a moral element here that said, I just can't do that. But the reality is, human beings are flawed in that there are base desires of self-preservation, of in this case, greed and gluttony that drive us to the behaviors to take the easy way out, to print the money for our own self-interest, for our own self-benefit. And so scarcity is there not because scarcity is inherently required in the system. It is there to minimize these sinful actions or behaviors of greed and gluttony that people all inherently have. That's a survival instinct. And the other element that I'd say that it also does is it forces us out of the sin of sloth. Now, sloth is, when I went through this exercise, was the most underrated of the sins, but at the same time was one of the more impactful ones for me, because sloth is the aversion to doing work. And when you think about what Bitcoin is, which is proof of work, you're starting to realize that Bitcoin is forcing us to do the work that we would otherwise try not to do, because we will always take the easy way out to create the value. So scarcity actually tackles 3 sins: sloth, greed, and gluttony. And then you can go why decentralized is as well. Again, it's a number of those sins. So we're actually solving for human behavior. And that's where the
would you
genesis
say,
from my... Sorry, go ahead.
would you say maybe as one of those sins, truth, it enforces truth, being this ledger that you cannot manipulate? Because one of, like you said, human behavior, if we could all trust human behavior, then there'll be no need for that scarcity. But this is the exact reason why a ledger exists, right?
Yep.
Being able to operate within a budget, if you will. And so it almost seems like it enforces the truth of maintaining a budget, the truth of staying within your means, if you will. Essentially Austrian economics, not spending outside of that realm.
See, I think it comes back to just greed again. Yes, there's
Right.
truth, but the transparency is a disincentive for people to try and doctor the ledger, to alter the ledger,
Right.
in order to effectively be greedy and take more than what they should have. So I still think it comes back down to self-interest, which is the sin of pride, and specifically in this case, greed, more than one actually deserves. And so the mechanism behind which we limit that behavior is through a decentralized ledger that creates a level of transparency so that no one individual can take advantage of the system in order to acquire more than they deserve. And that deserving element is of the value that they have created and have rightfully acquired through their proof of work. So again, I think it comes back down to one of those seven deadly sins. That truth element,
Yeah.
I think, for me personally, is about greed. And when you think about, if you just hear the word greed, it's almost synonymous
Yeah.
with banking, finance, and the fiat system. And so it all just comes back down to that one point. And so any solution that you put in place that limits our ability to be greedy is going to work incredibly well. And I think that's why Bitcoin has been so successful, because unlike any other monetary system in history, we've never been able to remove that element of the middleman as a result of how our society, how our civilization had evolved at that point in time. We always needed some sort of centralization to allow it to work. This is the first time
Yeah.
in human history where we have got that ability to be truly decentralized without sacrificing the capability of that system.
You know what? You know how,
Oh, so good.
it's quite interesting that you have those superheroes in your background, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, uh,
Spider-Man.
yeah, the greatest weakness is sometimes your biggest strength. And I am listening to you talk. And when you did your interview with Robin Sire, I said sometimes we say Bitcoin fixes everything, but sometimes we don't even really know what that means. And I'm saying this to say that if Satoshi was greedy, or if the seven sins overcome him, then Bitcoin loses because it moves the wallet, greed, everything just applies. But if that never happens, it's almost like freaking God sent Jesus Christ back to the planet the second time. Or like some savior from another planet is showing us how to fix our worldly problems, because that is everything that is wrong with this planet right now. I was listening to your interview and I was thinking of when I was a child in my teenage years, because I was brought up in a Christian family, but then I'm living around a bunch of Christian. I'm like, nobody practices this crap. Nobody can be like Jesus Christ. Like, this is just all bull crap. I'm like, but there's evil around us, and these evil people are just being super successful at being evil. But then I was listening to what you were saying about Bitcoin and how all of the seven sins connect, and I'm just like, would it be bad to say just I don't want to try to say Bitcoin is Jesus, but it's like freaking sending a God-given solution that its greatest strength is also its greatest weakness. But if the greatest strength stays, we'll get a chance to fix this planet.
So it's funny that you mentioned that. Since writing that, because I'm not a religious scholar, I've been very hesitant to draw any parallels between Jesus, the role that he played in that period of time to then found a lot of these principles, to what we're seeing now. And are there parallels between what Jesus did? And I'm not calling Satoshi Nakamoto a messiah, but are there parallels between what Jesus did and what Satoshi has done? And there, I think, are quite a few there. Not to say that he's a messiah, but maybe we've finally found someone that's able to act in that image to a degree where we've now created something of such great value. And so Satoshi's piece was the ultimate element of sacrifice when you actually think about it now today, which is similar, but nowhere near as big as Jesus on the cross taking on the sins of humanity. This one here is giving up the greatest treasure trove of wealth that will probably ever be known. Because if you project this out 20, 30, 40 years, that million Bitcoin is going to be greater than any one billionaire that currently lives on the planet.
Correct.
So he's given up wealth, and he's given up the name of being the creator of the greatest financial asset on the planet.
Yep.
So if that is not the ultimate sacrifice of pride, that is greed and self-interest completely walked away from, I don't know what is. And the fact that it so well aligns to every single sin and counteracts those sins to provide a path for humanity on how to live a more just moral life and in harmony with everybody. to the point where people say Bitcoin fixes everything or Bitcoin fixes the world. Maybe the world and everything is actually just ourselves because we are our own worst enemies. And this is then a pathway or at least a system or structure that incentivizes us in the right way to live a more virtuous, moral, better life.
Even crazier, it also heals the planet by removing pollution. Imagine that. Like we fix ourselves, humanity, or in the process, because in the process of creation, energy has to be consumed. That's just like
Yeah.
that's just normal. That's just how this planet works. And that consumption of energy we create, instead of calling it money, we're able to create, which is exactly what Bitcoin is doing here, is that the energy consumption is removing the pollution from the creations of mankind. Crazy.
Absolutely. And there's one individual
Yeah.
that I'd love to have a chat with on this, which is I've only recently seen him pop up on Twitter, which is Pastor Collins.
Yeah,
He's
yeah, 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 yeah.
I'd love to actually get a religious scholar slash practitioner
Yeah.
to sort of pulse check, sense check this, because
Mhm.
while I was raised a Hindu, I'm largely agnostic at this point. I still believe that there's probably something greater than all of us. I just don't know
Yeah.
what that is. And so while I'm trying to figure that out, I'm saying I'm agnostic. I'm not atheist at all.
Yep.
To
Likewise.
hear it from someone. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, same. I think it's same for me as well. And I think that by the way, if you do get the opportunity to speak with that religious scholar, invite me. I would like to come and
Yeah.
shake the ground. Um, but
Well,
the reason I
I've
say
actually
that is
messaged him, so that might be sooner than you think, to try and get
oh
that
yeah,
conversation
oh
going. Yeah.
listen, I'll be back in the US shortly, so yes, I'll be there to jump in. But the reason I say that is because I think that for one, um, maybe as a people, we need to just calm down on the fanatical um, mindset, like especially when it comes to religion, because we're looking at this Bitcoin thing, and I'm looking at it, I'm going, well, is there anything about it that Jesus would disagree with? And maybe there is, but for me so far, I've not seen it because it is something that is just very direct, honest, and not, it's, when you say do unto others as you would have them, as do unto others as do treat others as you treat yourself, right? Do unto others as you have them do unto you. That is, in a way, decentralization, right? Having that ability to just mm, allow people to live peacefully and for you to also get the same opportunities as well. It is unfortunate that if you bring this up, it is one of those things that is really difficult to get around anyone's mind when you start to compare it with, the sacrifice on the cross. If you're giving up this level of wealth, I don't know, I could probably argue that is as good as giving up your life as well, in some ways, right? Because you're giving up everything that you could be, right, or have the potential to be in the future, right? And so if you don't have that, then some could say that there is no life with that as well.
There is a mathematical calculation to that as well. And one of Michael Saylor's
Yeah,
pieces, which is Time is Energy,
Mm.
you
yeah,
could calculate at the median wage of any country how much life energy you've effectively accumulated that you can then pay someone to do your bidding, if you want to put it in
exactly.
those terms. Because when I did that against the Australian government debt, because I
Mhm.
wrote an article about that, talked to how governments on their current paths will become the largest slave owners in history.
Mm.
It was the fact that they keep printing money, but that printed money is taking from the future in order to spend in the present, but under the presumption that that investment creates greater wealth for the future. So it's a net positive. That was the theory behind it. But when you actually look at it, we're actually getting no benefit for the money getting printed, and it's all just getting centralized within a couple of powerful individuals across the globe for whatever the government prints. And so actually we've got a ballooning debt problem. Now, when you take the median wage in Australia, you look at the current debt levels of the country, which is just at 1.9 trillion when you look at all levels of government. And this is the part that most people in this space don't necessarily go into the detail. When you look at the US level debt or the Australian level debt, they often look at it at the federal government level. So this would be the federal government of the United States, the federal government of Australia. They sometimes neglect in these figures state level governments and then local level governments. So these are your councils, your municipalities, the state governments in the US. That'd be, California. That'd be probably Texas. That'd be, states.
Yeah.
When you add all of that
States, yeah.
together, it's far greater. When I did that for Australia, we look at it and we say we're just under $1 trillion, when in reality, we're actually at 1.9 trillion in aggregate across all levels of government in Australia. And when you look at the value, the median wage of our country, it would take the entire working population of Australia to work for free for 2 years to pay back the current debt levels that we've currently accumulated. So right now we're 2 years worth of enslaved labor of the future. You fast forward this at the rate in which we're money printing, and you project this out another 10, 15 years, that could easily go to 5, 10, 15 years of effectively forced labor that has been taken by the government from the future. So that's our children that are now effectively enslaved in this. So it's a form of modern slavery. So to the point, which is, does this save humanity? It's probably saving the next generation from being forced to work to pay back interest bills instead of working for themselves and their communities.
Come on, Arvin. What are you talking about, man? Come on, man. That's gaslighting, man. That is conspiracy theory. You don't know what you're talking about. You gotta see the stock markets. You gotta see the stock markets, right? The stock market is going up. We're making a lot more money. There's a lot more job. We have technology. We have AI. AI is gonna fix all of this problem. What you're talking about is just bullcrap.
I know. I'm pretty sure we said the same thing about the internet when the internet came, was going to revolutionize everything. And then social came and that was going to revolutionize everything. And now AI has come and it's going to revolutionize everything. Apparently. so we've been told.
I don't know what's stopping people, especially Australia, from waking up. Come on, like you guys actually are in the middle of everything. Like I'm on Twitter and I'm like, that's going on in Australia? That can happen in America, man. People will have blown up by now. But you guys
Correct.
are perfectly comfortable with it.
I'd say we're becoming increasingly less comfortable. And that's a very slow process because I think it comes down to the culture of the country. We've had a very different culture to a more, I'm trying to find the word for it because I don't want to try and describe another country that I've never actually never actually lived in, which is in case of the US, if you think about your gun rights, if you think about your own property rights, if you think about what people are willing to put up with, that's a cultural element that's ingrained within America itself. It's in the fabric. It just allows you to push back and to a degree, but far more than what we have in Australia. We gave up guns in the 90s.
Time out. It's the tactic. That is what we have going on in the southern borders of America right now. And that is what Canada is doing. You bring the foreigners with the submissive culture into your country and push out the aboriginals, the guys that will push back. That is why Australia is the way Australia is, because it's a mixing bowl of a bunch of softies.
Yeah, pretty much. I'm one of them, by the way. I came in from Malaysia, but I came in legally.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That's why
while I was over there, while I was over in Malaysia and Singapore, I think there's some parallels that can be drawn here. Kenny, one interesting thing you said there is essentially replacing the population, right? Changing from the maybe the nationals, the original group of people that would be there, and replacing them with a group of people that would accept the sort of rules that you want to push on them. This is what I mean by this. While I was in Malaysia, you get to meet Malaysians, right? Say if you just drop down at the airport, walk out there, just go to wherever that is famous, you get to meet the Malaysian people. You get to talk to them. If you go to Singapore, it's just a ton of buildings by banks, and you could see that there is definitely an effort that has been put there, and which is something that is very interesting, because I would actually like to ask about your, you have the article which you published as well, Arvin, with Bitcoin adoption across a couple of different nations, and I see Singapore is one of those ones you have in there as one of those that has crossed over that point of adoption. I think is 20% or more, but we also have to look at the population that is in there. By the way, I hope, are you guys hearing me clearly?
Yeah,
Yep.
we can hear you. I'm over here trying to look for Singapore on the chat. Yeah, go ahead.
Gotcha. Right. Hey, listen, you gotta always clarify, it's African internet, right?
Yeah.
So
24% Singapore.
about 24%, right? So
Yep.
while I was there in Singapore, on the ground, for me at least visually, it seems like a situation where you have people with exorbitant amounts of money that have rolled in, set up shop, and most of the people that you see up front are foreigners, right? Obviously, they have these massive buildings there. Someone has to be doing the work in the banks. But to meet the locals, you have to just go to maybe this one small section of the island, right, which is kind of out of the way. And they have, essentially total control of the rules and everything like that. And it seems to me a similar thing can be unfolding in the US, where we have this massive population. From what I understand at this point, at least 30 million people have now crossed the border into the US. And we see that these people are, in some cases getting favorable treatment, whether it's housing, free food, and so on and so forth. And you can see how this will potentially upset the Americans in the future, the ones with the guns. However, the point where people would actually get to retaliate, if you will likely be so far ahead, where there will probably be a plan to subdue them and remove them from society. So it might be by association, right? Say if you are associated with this group of people, maybe say January 6th.
January 6th, yeah.
Right? They can come collect all of you and go lock you up before you can actually retaliate. And then the population that is in there are the ones that are less fortunate, will come in, and they've never experienced this level of access before. So they will say yes to everything. And so the only option then is for those who have experienced that high level of access to either exit or be now considered what they're naming a dissident. And it's quite insane. But it seems to me that, well, at least in this case, it did not. I wonder how Bitcoin would help a place like Singapore, unless if it's just in the hand of the wealthy. Go ahead.
As you were talking through that, I was trying to think the differences between what's happening in the US now with your open borders versus what's going on in Singapore, the UAE, or the Middle East more broadly.
Yeah.
I think the clear difference is you don't hear about open borders to let anyone and everyone in Singapore or the UAE. You have far stricter, tighter border controls, sovereign borders in these Asian and Middle Eastern countries. Yes, there is a huge influx of what I'd call foreign nationals. And so you see expatriates working there. And even when I graduated, I knew a couple of my classmates that went to Singapore and to Dubai to work. Yes, but they had to be registered. They were on a working visa, and then they left. They weren't granted permanent residency, voting rights, or the ability to influence the direction of the country. They were there to do the work to put the country forward rather than backward. And the other element is, Singapore was born out of Malaysia, in that they separated from Malaysia in, I think, the 50s. And it was a country that then overtook Malaysia in terms of economic prosperity because they were far more capitalistic, merit driven, and a great vision by the prime minister at that point, which has created this hub in Southeast Asia, in Singapore, and to a point where it challenged Hong Kong for supremacy around being the financial hub for Asia, or for at least Southeast Asia. And so they've created great economic prosperity. And having some family over there as well, I'd say the central business district of Singapore, yes, you'd probably see a lot of expats because you've got a lot of global headquartered companies there, which send their people in order to operate out of the region. But you go out a couple of suburbs or, 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers outside of that CBD, you start to see the Singaporeans who are naturalized citizens that do live on the outskirts and then commute in. So I definitely see, yes, there's a lot of foreign nationals, but it's how those foreign nationals are integrating or in those countries, which is the big difference. The US open border, and now they want those individuals to vote because there's no voter ID laws. And so suddenly illegal immigrants can now vote in federal elections, which makes zero sense. That's just the most stupid thing I've ever heard. But you would not see that problem. And this is my own personal belief. I don't have the data to back it up. I don't think you would see that in the UAE and Singapore. So I think that there's a difference there. And to the point of adoption, this is where I think now we're going to start seeing the shift in the world order. Because in that analysis that I did on adoption rates, so I will preface that is not just Bitcoin, that's Bitcoin and crypto, because right now the available data publicly available just isn't there for Bitcoin only, not to this level. So this is, I'll call it digital assets more broadly, but it talks to the propensity or the likelihood of a population to be welcoming or receptive of Bitcoin. So I still think it's valuable. What we're seeing in that data is that where the West dominated internet adoption, and as a result capitalized and got a lot of the value of the internet itself. So that's where the US was well ahead, but parts of Europe were well ahead. The Nordic countries were extremely well ahead in their adoptions. When you look at it now in comparison to Bitcoin and crypto more broadly, it's completely shifted. It's now shifted to the Middle East, Asia, and South America. So if you look at it from that, you've got foreign borders that are well protected. You've got the ability for these countries to bring in the skill sets they need to advance their countries, which has been shown in the Middle East has gone from strength to strength. You look at them 20 years ago to now, it's just like a completely different country. They've built the infrastructure, they've built incredible things. Singapore's in similar boat, but they've got control over who comes in, who goes out, who votes, who doesn't. And now they're advancing in this. Yeah. And now they're advancing in digital assets in their adoption. So this whole piece around the economic center of being the US, I think, is a foregone conclusion almost now, that it's probably not going to be for much longer, that this economic center of the world is going to shift away from the United States towards Asia and the Middle East. And if you saw a global map, you'd say China's here, India is here, the Middle East is somewhere here. It's going to be centered there. And where these digital assets are going, I think, is one of those data points and indicators that they're going to capture a lot of that wealth as this transition out of the fiat system starts to happen. These are the countries that at a per capita level will get greater than their fair share of that economic prosperity.
This is so right. Before the Ukraine-Russian war, we did a presentation about why Bitcoin is so critical for the East at this point, not knowing exactly what you're talking about right now, because when you look at the geography or the map of the world, and you look at the size of Asia, China, Russia next to each other, right? Literally, it's all small little tiny islands in Europe, right? Partnering with America on its own little big island, whereas the real competition is all of Asia. But this entire time, trade must go through Europe, London, or come through the US. And I think they've finally gotten tired from the starvation and the different ways they've been using the BIS and all these different systems. They've been using to abuse the dollar with sanctions against the entire Eastern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, and Africa. So they've eventually gotten tired. And when we look at the Ukraine-Russian war, it's a fight back against exactly what you're talking about. The placement of Israel on that map, surrounded by Turkey, Iran, Iraq, the UAE, and everything else, and putting Israel right there, has been a strategic placement since World War II, because they know that they do not have the strength. And the strength that they have was just because of the war, and it's temporary. So what we're talking about is that Bitcoin displaces all of that and gives the country that understands store of value. If you get it and you get it fast, you get a chance to attract talent, money to your country. They're trying to compete with power, with guns. Because that's what I'm looking at right now. And Asia seems to be getting it in terms of crypto. They've not gotten the old Bitcoin concept yet. America still has a chance though. That's what I'm thinking. Because we can print money faster to buy more.
Maybe, but the piece that I'll say maybe invalidates that.
Yeah.
There's this quote that has been going around on any podcast
Yeah.
that you can listen to at some point, and it goes something like, "Strong times, no, weak men create hard times. Hard times create strong men.
Strong men.
Strong men create
Right.
easy times, and easy times create soft men."
Yep.
I think that the world has been in different elements of that cycle. So the US and the West were in those hard times initially
times.
through the wars, and
Yep.
then created an incredible powerhouse of a country. They then got complacent because times got easy. They offloaded all of their production to China, offloaded all of their grunt work labor in IT to India.
Yeah.
They've created now hard times for themselves. And these soft men, if that's the analogy, are now going to go through their downfall, because what we've got in the East and Asia is, while the US is going through their easy times, Asia and the Middle East were going through their hard times. They've created the hard men. So right now you've got the hardness of the Middle East and Asia against the softness of the West. And who's going to win out on that? And you look at that from the lens of production, all manufactured goods and services. You look
Vietnam,
at
China,
IT,
India,
Philippines, India,
Taiwan.
correct? You look at semiconductor chips all out of Taiwan, so they're realizing, oh no, if China were to go to war in Taiwan, the US is screwed. So I see way too much offloading of critical, what I'd call infrastructure to a degree, that is the ability to produce everything that your country needs to survive, off into these cheaper countries, because that was the arbitrage in order to create greater paper wealth for the US. And now that you've got this geopolitical instability, you're starting to see the narratives of all these countries shift to, we need to have our own production onshore. So Australia just announced our own Australia Made program by the current government that's looking to invest billions in order to try and get local manufacturing here. We're seeing the same thing out of Canada. We're seeing the same thing out of now Trump and his campaigns in for the United States. But my gut says too little, too late.
Yep.
And by the time that you rebuild all of that infrastructure in order to support your country, India, China, the Middle East, who have all of that already here and are now ahead on Bitcoin adoption, have got too much of a lead that it would take a monumental stuff up for them to screw it up and not actually shift the economic power away.
Look at us talking
Yeah, I think-
geopolitics and talking as if we are over here on a CNBC Bloomberg trying to teach the world. IMF and World Bank knows nothing, man. This is the real
Well, no,
strategy
I
right
think
So
here.
we'll see.
yeah, it's like trying to stop a ship, you know. You just can't turn on a dime. And
Correct.
it's just one of those realities that we have to just look at. And for me, you know, I think it's probably best for anyone to more really educate themselves and place themselves at a play in an advantageous position. You know, that could mean moving away from where you are. Because there is this idea, and this is what I think is the most asinine thing to me. There is this idea in America that you're supposed to be, I guess, patriotism, right? Let's just call it that. You're supposed to fight for your nation, but you cannot fight for a nation that is literally working against you. Kind of, it just cannot work. And it's one of those things where, like you said, Arvin, there's been too many decisions that have been made that has put us where we are, and it's just, you know, the steam is just full steam now, and before you stop it, all these other nations, and I think it's not just smart men and not just strong men, right, making better times. When you look at Asia, it's not just strong men, it's also smart men in this case, and which that is also a lot more potent, right? That has the ability to take these other continents so much farther.
And when
That's,
I
you
say
know, also an
strong
area of
men, when I say strong men,
yeah,
my definition of that in this context is personal accountability, hard
yeah,
work, has faced adversity, so knows what bad looks like and knows what good can look like and fights toward it, who
yeah,
isn't complacent, and always puts their families and their countries effectively ahead of their own personal interests as well.
I, I
So
think
when you
that's what.
combine all
Go
of
ahead.
that,
Go ahead.
that's what I think strong men,
yeah,
and I think it's strong men, strong women, strong country, whatever we want to call it.
yeah,
I think that's the
yeah.
strength.
Yeah, and I
Absolutely.
think
It's,
that is what Africa is missing right now. We're probably starting to see a little bit of that in Mali, Niger, at the moment, but Africa is lacking
absolutely.
exactly what you just mentioned.
Yeah. I think it's always kind of been, for the West, it's always been this, the idea of strong has always been that brute force,
Mm.
right? Just having this ability to essentially just going, well, we this is what we want. You either give us what we want, or, you know, we have firepower for days to just make sure that you never ever prosper. And I think we're just in a phase where that sort of approach is far outdated. I think we're more in this space of, you know, technological warfare, and in that realm, I think the rest is also, you know, just not there. As I always say, you know, like any empire is just another empire that is falling at this point in time, and I don't know. It just seems to me that it is stupid for people who choose to attach themselves to it and go down with the ship when we have something as incredible as Bitcoin that can allow the individual and a nation to place itself in a much more advantageous position at these
I could
days.
see how for a lot of people, like when I talk to a couple of people here, they will say
Yeah,
that they are considering moving abroad, taking their life, lifting and shifting. But if I look at my
yeah,
personal circumstance, I don't think I'm there yet where I think that I
mm,
need to take everything that I've got, my Bitcoin with me, and move to another country where I'd probably live lavishly. There's an element of me that says that the Australia of that I grew up in was one of the greatest upbringings you could have. Like you would be playing in the street with other kids that you were living
yeah,
with, big backyard. It would be barbecues with friends and family. There was hard work everywhere. There was a level of prosperity that we had, which was, uh, granted, I grew up in the country, but having Malaysia as a comparison, given all my cousins and whatnot were living there, I saw Australia
right,
as definitely the better option. I don't think that that's necessarily 100% lost. And so, to the point of if that's the culture or the country that I want to be living in, does that exist in some of these countries that we're talking about now? And we'll just use Singapore and the UAE. And the answer is no. So the reason why I could see why I'd want to stay, have these kind of conversations with yourselves, we're talking out of Africa, the US, Australia, have a globally relevant conversation, is to inspire others where we live as to what is possible and to fight for it if you want to preserve the culture that you believe is the culture that you want to live in.
Yeah.
And so it's not necessarily about just being portable. I think to the point of patriotism, it's fighting for where you want to put your next generation as well to be living in. And you want to do the hard work in order to get the best possible life for them. And for me, I think it's still Australia. And so I'd probably first try my hand at politics myself, not anytime soon, because I just don't want to put myself through that torture yet. But it would be some point in the future where I've done the work that I want to do with the Bitcoin curve, which I think is a 10-year project, 10, 15-year project, by the time all the research is done, to then say, how do I then take all those learnings and start to implement them in my own country so that we can benefit from it? Because to the point of civilizations rise, civilizations fall. It's cyclic. History would say that that's the case. We've seen it with almost every single empire. The question is, do you go towards comfort because it's easier? Or do you stand up in the face of that adversity and fight for the country that may be in decline but could be brought back in 50 years, 100 years? And I think the Bitcoin ethos is one of proof of work, one of pushing against, one of fighting for the right thing. And if you go back to my thesis, which is it's solving for human behavior, if I truly wanted to act myself with that Bitcoin ethos, it is I want to fight against my sin of sloth, which is the aversion to doing the work. In this case, it's a stupidly high hill in order to climb of work in order to bring this country back to where it needs to be. But the Bitcoin ethos would say I should actually fight against that sin of sloth and do the work. I shouldn't come back into my sin of greed, which is I could take all my money now and live a lavish life overseas and use my wealth in order to get a greater quality of life. I should temper that sin of greed and actually give back as much as I can with the wealth that I've been able to create so that others around me can also rise alongside me. So I think that there's multiple ways that we can look at it. And my personal view is that we all need to fight.
I think there's definitely multiple ways of looking at it. And I think actually when ultimately it is similar from how I'm describing it to your situation as well. Because Australia is where you grew up. And when we look at it, at least from my perspective as an African, I look at it as Bitcoin is that opportunity for us to try to transform the environment that we grew up in, which is Africa, right? America is a melting pot. I think that there are other people that can probably speak to Bitcoin for America in a different way than I would. But for someone like myself, where I grew up in Africa up until the point when I moved to the US, it seems like it presents an opportunity. It's not going to be an opportunity of a lavish lifestyle, but it's definitely going to be an opportunity to transform the African economy, or the Africa that we all grew up in, and as we've always known it, always being influenced by outside powers, right? Like Kenny mentioned earlier, places like Burkina Faso and Mali and Niger. And we see them kind of empowered at this point to kick out these Western nations that occupy your environment and provide no benefits to you. And the fact that to a large extent it's allowed, or it goes on because these nations have no way of protecting themselves.
Absolutely.
The decentralization of the go ahead.
I was going to say that's absolutely the case. I think local context for the message is going to be the next wave that spurs the next wave of adoption. What I mean by that is if we look at the technology adoption curve, so I'm going back to the more technical analysis, We've already done the innovator and the early adopters phase of the technology adoption cycle in these countries that we've been talking about. When you hit about 16% of the addressable market adoption, the early adopters and the innovators have already been tick the box, they're on board. When you start to look at the early majority, it's no longer those people that love change, that are anarchists, that are, would vote for any sort of change just because they are that high risk tolerating individuals. You're now talking about everyday people. You're talking about the doctor that's trying to heal a patient. You're talking about the teacher that's trying to educate the next generation. You're talking about construction workers and whoever it might be, restaurant owners. They are going to need people that understand who they are, that understand their local context, as in what it means to be an educator in Australia, or what it means to be a police officer in Ethiopia, or whatever it might be. So they need to hear the message from someone that understands them, because unless they hear about Bitcoin in a way that creates the right, I'll call it product market fit, in this case, it's probably life fit for them in their context, it's not going to click. And everyone, and I think you and I have done it, which is we've all had our aha moment. And sometimes it was just because we heard something in a slightly different way from a particular individual. When we reflect, we say it's exactly what we've heard before, but for whatever reason, that one time it landed. We need to create more of those moments. But for this early majority of adopters, from this 16% up to 50%, we're talking about everyday people. So when you talk about your African context and your African understanding, you should be leaning into that, because your message is going to land far better than some American talking about it who doesn't know anything about Africa. Same way that I'll know something about Australia that Americans won't know about our country because there's nuance. Same thing about someone in the Middle East, in Asia. So I think we now need to divide and conquer, work within our own individual context where we've got the experience and the empathy for what's occurring there, to land the message in the way that shows what the real value of Bitcoin is, so that we accelerate this adoption now out of the early adopters phase. We're hitting that chasm, which is this point at which we stall, and it stalls because people don't understand it, because it's not the right market fit for them. These sort of localized contextual discussions is what will get us over that chasm to mass adoption.
Harvey,
Incredible.
you giving all this great, like you just said something really cool right now, and I think you need to what you call it, copyright it. Product life fit. I repeat, product life fit. That's amazing. This is not about the market. This is about your life. Because everything about the market is really you in the market. It's your life. That goes to having your that word, that PL
that phrase.
that phrase.
PLF. We'll trademark it. I'll share the trademark with you guys.
Goes to Arvin, right?
Hey, made right. You heard it here first.
You heard it here first.
Yeah, it's an exclusive. You guys can have half the copyright or half the trademark of it if I ever do it.
You need to do it. Product life.
It's all good.
No, in the Bitcoin standard, you need the product life fit.
Or maybe it's Bitcoin life fit.
Bitcoin is the product, is the world's greatest product, is Bitcoin. So,
DLF.
Yeah. But you mentioned something, the empathy. And we've also talked about this on our show several times. And I know we're probably running close to an hour now. Empathy and capitalism. Remember we talked about the 7 deadly sins? Doesn't capitalism cover, like, capitalism is just all of the 7 deadly sins, if you can forgive me for saying that. But can we have an empathetic capitalism?
It depends on the system in which we're operating. So, and this is where I get into trouble with Bitcoin maximalists who are often, we don't need government at all. Because there's an element of, if you think of Bitcoin as a system, it creates the guardrails by which we all agree to play. And then it's all based on merit, who accumulates the wealth. So in a system that we all agree, in this case, Bitcoin, if we believe that it does solve for all of these sins, if some person is able to create greater value and as a result be rewarded in this system with more Bitcoin, I don't see that as necessarily greed or gluttony or whatnot, because those sins are gone. They've actually done the work and they are deserving of what it is that they then receive.
Mm.
The role of government in capitalism is the regulations. It's the element that ensures that everyone is playing by the same set of rules
Mm.
so that it is fair for whoever wins and loses. It's supposed to be enabling a true meritocracy. Now, the
Transparency.
problem,
Mm.
transparency, merit and whatnot, so that pure merit and the best thing wins out.
Mm.
I can't remember who I heard it from, but I think one of the AI companies has gone from DEI to MEI, which
Mm.
is merit, intelligence, and experience, or something like that. And those three things, instead of DEI, it's MEI. And that's a meritocratic society where the best ideas, the best people should win out.
Yeah.
Now, the way in which government has operated today, I think, is absolutely a joke,
Mm.
in that they have not created the structures in order to ensure that that plays out. And so that there's still an element that, if we were to say, the stock market, capitalism is the seven deadly sins, I don't think that's the case. I think that the market is operating in the system that has been created to their own benefit. What we need is the system to be sorted so that we're all playing by the same rules, and then capitalism will be in its true form the best system to operate in. So we need governments to, number one, scale themselves back. They are way too big for what they should be doing, and start focusing in on, and this is why this research I'm doing, I think, is going to be so critically important. I'm looking to scale Bitcoin's principles beyond money. The seven deadly sins framework, simplicity, meritocracy, those are the three principles that I see behind Bitcoin. My research is about saying, how do we take these principles that have proven themselves to work in money? How do we take those principles? So minimize the adverse human behaviors, which is number one, seven deadly sins. Second one is meritocracy. The third is simplicity. How do we take those three things and apply it to government, healthcare, education, infrastructure? And so that's what my research is all about. And this is why I think it's a 10, 15-year project, because Bitcoin is the first success story of this system, but for money. I want to see how this works across everything else. And to your point around capitalism, it starts with government. So how do we apply that seven deadly sins behavior framework, simplicity, meritocracy, to make sure that they are creating free and open markets that make sure that everyone's playing by the rules so that the best things win out? So I think capitalism is still the greatest system there. It's just that we've perverted the rules of the system through government.
Man, this is what we'll say on this channel. Exactly what you just explained there will be perfect on the African continent, because that is exactly that application of your research on the African continent. I don't want to
Yes.
call it will make Africa the global power, but that is exactly what the continent is lacking right now.
Yeah, I think it would definitely make Africa the strongest it's been, a power in its own light, and that's what we are hoping to realize one day. So we'll definitely be staying in touch with you, Arvin, and continuously
Absolutely.
learning about your research there, because I think it's very important. And before we wrap it up here, I also say one other area, especially recently after my trip to Malaysia, I'm I'm still just gathering the ideas. So maybe I'll be reaching out to you for some tips on how to put together a proper paper. But Bitcoin and mental health. Not saying that it fixes mental health, but I think, a few years back, Kenny and I interviewed a doctor, and we spoke about mental health and how people with extreme mental health challenges deal with money. But I think mental health is also something that's, if you have a brain, it's something that you have to be paying attention to, right? We all have a brain. We all have experiences in life, be it good or bad. And how does that affect how we interact with money? And how can Bitcoin change um, people's mental health when it comes to dealing with money? And I think it goes under that category of human behavior. So I look forward to staying engaged with you. Please also take this as an invite back to the show. This is your platform, sir. Anytime.
Absolutely.
All right. If you run into a major breakthrough, please join us anytime, and let's talk about it and share it with the rest of the world. Double up.
Absolutely. Will do. I think you guys are my second podcast, by the way. So I've only just started this journey on this. So Robin was my first, and it was through Robin that I found you guys. And it's just your approach has been really interesting to that point of you need local context, you need the message in the right way for that right audience. You guys have got that unique
Absolutely.
one. And your logo, by the way, was the one that caught my eye, because my one and only tattoo is a wolf and an eagle, and that wolf almost looks like the one that you've got in your background in blue. So I was like, okay,
yeah.
I take my shirt off, but
Amazing.
it's on my back. But no, you guys are doing
Yeah.
a great job, because the way you guys talk about certain things will land with a particular audience, and so you'll create your own ground movement in a part of the population that just isn't being serviced today by the bigger podcasts, the bigger brands. So I think doing a great job, and it was awesome to have a chat to you guys here.
That's awesome. Thank you for the feedback. That really means a lot to us. You know, a lot of times we just pick up and we just go. We're just literally just going based on our experiences as well. We cannot talk about things we don't know, right? So
correct. And
the
progress over
is
perfection.
really helpful. Yeah, exactly.
Progress over perfection. Who cares about it being polished 100%? You know, just get it out there.
Yeah.
Start something. You'll learn.
Exactly. So thank you for that feedback. Really means a lot. Kenny, you have anything you want to add before we'll pass over to Robin to let us know where people can find his work?
Yes.
We'll
I would like to say, champions, this has been one of the best ever, because literally Australia, Africa, and America, 3 different continents. The first one, right? Again, thank you. We just made this happen. Definitely watch for more. I've been up to you.
Well, there's only 2 places really on X, at ArvsNotes, ARVSNOTES. Still early days with my Twitter profile. I only really started doing it about 3 months ago, but I'll be constantly posting there updates on the research before it gets released, and on my Substack, and it's all free of charge. So, you know, you can go in to the Substack, subscribe, get all my content for free, and it's thebitcoincurve.substack.com. And one more thing is I'm going to start doing video audio versions of the articles, because I think what people are telling me is some of these articles are quite long. They can be 15, 20-minute reads. So I'll start doing a video audio version of it as well. So it's just a bit easier and more accessible to a couple of people. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Incredible. Well,
look at that beautiful smile. Look at that beautiful smile.
Back in my corporate attire when I was wearing a suit jacket.
Looking sharp, sir. Looking sharp. Incredible. And the work is even sharper. We'll put it that way.
Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning into this STAKK podcast.
Sun God.